Imagine this: you walk into a casino with just $20 in your pocket. The lights are flashing, the machines are calling, and every spin feels like it could change your life. But here's the truth. One decision can either make you a winner or break you in seconds. And what happened next? Nobody saw coming. Officer Rick Thompson had built a reputation in town, but not the kind any true officer should want. People didn't look at him with respect. They looked at him with fear. His uniform gave him authority, but his badge had become more like a shield for his arrogance than a symbol of justice. Rick wasn't interested in protecting the community. He was interested in control. If someone questioned him, he raised his voice. If someone complained, he slapped them with a ticket they didn't deserve. He thrived on intimidation, and the sad truth was, most people were too scared or too tired to fight back. For Rick, this meant power was easy. Every ticket he wrote, every fine he imposed, became another reminder that he could bend the law to his will. One warm afternoon, Angela Martinez was driving home after a long shift at the diner where she worked. She was a single mother of two, always juggling her job, bills, and her children's needs. That day had been exhausting, but she still felt a quiet sense of relief as she turned onto the familiar road that would take her home. Her old sedan moved at a steady pace, well within the speed limit, her hands at 10 and 2 on the wheel. That's when she saw flashing red and blue lights in her rearview mirror. Her stomach dropped. She checked her speedometer well below the limit. She used her blinker properly. Her seatbelt was on. She hadn't done anything wrong. Still, she carefully pulled over to the side of the road, heart pounding in her chest. Rick Thompson strolled up to her window with the swagger of a man who thought the world belonged to him. His sunglasses reflected the nervous look on Angela's face as he leaned in. License and registration, he demanded flatly. Angela quickly handed them over, still confused. Did I do something wrong, officer? Rick didn't answer right away. He scribbled something on his notepad, then glanced up at her with a smirk. Reckless driving, he said, his tone casual, as if her guilt was already decided. Angela's eyes widened. Reckless? No, I wasn't. Save it for court, Rick interrupted sharply, shoving the citation at her. He didn't care about her explanation. He didn't even bother pretending to listen. To him, it was a game he had already won. People never fought back. They just paid the fine or lost in court. Angela sat frozen, gripping the steering wheel, as Rick turned and walked back to his squad car. Her blood boiled with a mix of shock and anger. She wasn't speeding. She wasn't reckless. She had done absolutely nothing wrong. This wasn't about safety. It was about power. As Rick's taillights disappeared down the road, Angela sat for a long moment, staring at the ticket in her hand. The numbers glared back at her, reminding her of money she didn't have. Hours she would have to work just to cover a fine that wasn't fair in the first place, but then something in her shifted. She thought of her kids, how hard she worked to give them a better life, how often she reminded them to stand up for themselves, no matter how tough things got. What kind of example would she be if she let this go without a fight? Angela took a deep breath and straightened her shoulders. She wasn't going to roll over. She wasn't going to let Officer Rick Thompson intimidate her the way he had intimidated so many others. If he thought she would be just another easy victim of his abuse of power, he was wrong. She folded the ticket carefully and tucked it into her bag. Court wouldn't be easy. She knew the odds were stacked against her after all. Who would believe a single mother over a police officer? But she also knew something else. The truth was on her side. And sometimes the truth was enough to turn the tide. Rick, meanwhile, drove off without a second thought. To him, Angela was just another name on a citation slip, another person who would soon be handing over money to the court. He didn't even consider the possibility that she might fight back. But what Rick didn't realize was that this single, seemingly ordinary traffic stop was about to change everything. For years, he had hidden behind his badge, confident no one could touch him. But in trying to intimidate Angela, he had picked the wrong woman. She wasn't going to let this go. And when the two finally met again in the courtroom, Rick would learn that his badge wasn't nearly as untouchable as he believed. Rick Thompson strolled into the courthouse that morning with the same arrogance he always carried. The shine on his badge caught the light, his uniform pressed crisp and perfect. To the outside world, he looked like a picture of authority. But to those who really knew him, that badge was more of a mask hiding years of intimidation and lies. He had been here dozens of times before, and it was always the same. He would testify with a calm, professional tone. The judge would accept his version of events without question. The defendant, whoever had the misfortune of being pulled over, would lose. Sometimes they cried, sometimes they argued, but it never mattered. Rick always won. So when he walked through those courtroom doors, he expected no different. Angela Martinez was just another name on a ticket, another face he would crush with the weight of his authority. In his mind, she'd probably show up nervous, hands shaking, maybe even begging for leniency. He couldn't wait to see her defeated expression when the judge sided with him, just as always. But when Angela walked in, Rick's smug confidence wavered for the first time. She didn't look broken. She didn't look scared. She looked determined. Her chin was lifted, her shoulders squared, and in her hands was a thick folder stuffed with papers and documents. She walked as if she belonged. There, as if she had already prepared for war, Rick frowned slightly but brushed it off. She crack, he thought to himself. They always do. The bailiff called the courtroom to order, and the case began. Rick was called first, and he did what he always did, slid easily into his polished routine. He painted Angela as a reckless driver who had endangered others on the road. He spoke with confidence, using the same measured tone he had perfected over the years. Every word rolled off his tongue like a rehearsed script. The defendant, Rick said firmly, was driving in a manner that put both herself and other motorists at risk. I observed her swerving and exceeding the safe speed limit. In my professional judgment, issuing a citation was necessary for public safety. As he finished, Rick glanced at the judge, fully expecting the usual nod of approval. His lips curled into the faintest smile. To him, the case was already won. But then Angela was called forward. She rose from her seat slowly, her folder clutched. In her hands, she didn't stumble or stutter. Instead, her voice came out steady, clear, and stronger than Rick had anticipated. Your Honor, she began, opening her folder. I respect the work that police officers do. But what Officer Thompson has said about me today is not true. I wasn't driving recklessly, and I have proof. With that, she handed over a USB drive. The judge raised an eyebrow as the bailiff inserted into a computer. Seconds later, security footage from a nearby store played on the courtroom monitor. The video clearly showed Angela's car passing by slow, steady, and perfectly within the lane. Not even a hint of reckless driving, murmurs rippled through the courtroom. Rick's jaw tightened, but Angela wasn't finished. She called on two witnesses' neighbors who had been driving behind her that day. They testified under oath that she had been driving normally, obeying every rule. Each word from them chipped away at Rick's credibility. Angela then laid out her timeline, her receipts from the diner she had just left, and even traffic data showing the average speed on that road at the time. Piece by piece, her evidence formed a wall too solid for Rick's lies to climb. The tension in the courtroom thickened. Rick shifted uncomfortably in his chair, his palms beginning to sweat. For the first time in his career, his word alone wasn't enough. The truth was being laid bare, and it wasn't in his favor. The judge leaned back in her chair, expression unreadable, but her eyes stayed on Rick a moment too long. That silent stare pierced through his once unshakable confidence. He could feel it. He was losing control. Angela, on the other hand, stood taller with every passing second. She wasn't just fighting for herself anymore. She was standing up for every person Rick had ever bullied, every innocent driver he had ever fined unjustly. By the time she finished, the courtroom was silent. Angela closed her folder and took a step back, her breathing steady. Rick tried to muster his usual composure, but his hands betrayed him, fidgeting on the table. The sweat on his forehead glistened under the fluorescent lights. For the first time in years, Officer Rick Thompson realized something terrifying. His badge wasn't protecting him anymore. His authority wasn't enough. And the woman, he thought, would-be easy prey had just turned the courtroom into his biggest nightmare. Judge Owens leaned forward, her sharp gaze cutting through the silence. The room seemed to freeze as her voice rang out, steady and commanding. "Officer Thompson," she said firmly, "your testimony does not match the evidence presented here. Today, do you have an explanation?" Rick's throat tightened. He wasn't used to being questioned not like this. In his world, his word was law. He cleared his throat, trying to force out something that sounded convincing. Maybe the cameras were wrong. Maybe the witnesses misremembered." His voice cracked, his usual confidence slipping with every word. The judge raised her hand, cutting him off. "That's enough." The finality in her tone made the room go still. Rick sank slightly in his chair, his heart pounding. Judge Owens turned her attention to Angela. Her stern features softened ever so slightly. "The charges against you are dismissed," she declared. "You are free to go." Angela let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. Relief washed over her like a wave, and for a brief moment she felt 10 feet tall. She had done it, stood up against a corrupt officer and won, but the story didn't end there. Judge Owens shifted her gaze back to Rick. This time, her expression carried the weight of authority Rick had once thought belonged only to him. "This court," she continued, "cannot ignore what we have seen today. Officer Thompson, your credibility is in question. Therefore, I am ordering an internal review of your conduct." Gasps and whispers spread through the courtroom like wildfire. The spectators leaned in, exchanging wide-eyed looks. For years, people had whispered about Rick's behavior, but no one had dared challenge him. Now, right in front of everyone, his armor of authority was being torn apart. Rick's face went pale. The confident smirk he always wore had vanished, replaced by a hollow expression. His hands trembled slightly as he realized the gravity of the judge's words. This wasn't just a case he had lost. This was the beginning of an unraveling. Angela stood silently, watching it all unfold. Part of her wanted to smile, to celebrate, but she knew this moment was bigger than her. This wasn't just justice for her, it was justice for everyone Rick had wronged. Rick tried one last desperate attempt. "Your Honor, with all due respect, my record speaks for itself. I've served this community for years. Surely we don't need to drag this out over one small misunderstanding." Judge Owen's eyes narrowed. "Misunderstanding?" she repeated, her tone sharp as a blade. "Officer Thompson, this was not a misunderstanding. This was a deliberate attempt to misuse your position, and I will not allow this court or this community to be treated in such a way." The room fell into a stunned silence. Rick swallowed hard, feeling as if the walls were closing in. Angela gathered her belongings quietly. Her heart still raced, but now it raced with triumph instead of fear. She had stood against a bully and won not just for herself, but for the community that had suffered under his abuse. As she walked out of the courtroom, people she didn't even know gave her nods of respect. Some whispered, "Good job," while others simply looked at her with admiration. For the first time in a long while, Angela felt seen and heard. Back inside, Rick sat frozen, the reality of his situation sinking in. His career, the power he had clung to, was now slipping through his fingers. The whispers in the courtroom weren't just gossip. They were the sound of a reputation collapsing. The bailiff approached and placed a hand on Rick's shoulder. "You'll need to stay for further instructions," he said calmly. Though the weight of the moment made it feel like shackles being placed on Rick's pride, Rick wanted to protest, to shout, to reclaim control, but his voice failed him. The badge on his chest, once his shield, now felt heavy, almost mocking. Judge Owens rose from her seat, signaling the end of the hearing. "This session is adjourned," she announced, her gavel striking the desk with a sharp crack that echoed through the chamber. The sound sealed Rick's fate. As the courtroom emptied, Rick sat alone, staring at the floor. For the first time in his life, he wasn't feared. He wasn't respected. He was simply a man exposed for what he truly was, and outside, Angela walked into the sunlight, her steps lighter than they had been in years. She knew the fight wasn't over. There would be an investigation, and Rick's actions would finally come to light. But for now, she allowed herself to smile, because in that courtroom, justice had spoken louder than fear. And the badge that Rick thought made him untouchable had just become the very thing that would bring him down. The review into Rick's conduct opened a floodgate. What started as a single complaint from Angela turned into an avalanche of evidence. Investigators began digging into his record, and what they found shocked even the most seasoned officers. There were complaint after complaint. Citizens who had been too afraid to speak out before suddenly came forward. Some said Rick had written tickets for violations that didn't exist. Others described being pulled over late at night and intimidated into silence. A few even admitted they had tried to file complaints in the past, but nothing ever came of it. Rick always had a way of twisting the truth, hiding behind the shiny badge on his chest. For years, his abuse of power had been brushed aside. People believed him because he was an officer, and in court, his word almost always outweighed the word of ordinary citizens. But Angela's case had broken the pattern. For the first time, someone hadn't backed down. She had fought, she had presented evidence, and she had won. Her courage created a ripple effect that spread through the entire community. Within weeks, Rick was suspended. His desk was cleared out, his patrol car reassigned. For a man who had built his identity on the authority of his uniform, the suspension alone felt like a prison sentence. Gone were the days of swaggering through the streets, barking orders just to show he could. Now, he sat at home, waiting for updates from the internal review. His future slipping further away each day. The review board wasn't just thorough, they were relentless. Every incident in Rick's career was put under a microscope. Each time, they uncovered another false ticket, another fabricated charge. The picture became clearer. This wasn't a mistake or a one-time lapse in judgment. This was a pattern. This was who Rick really was. Even his fellow officers who had once kept their heads down and said nothing began to speak out. Some admitted they had long suspected his misconduct but feared retaliation. Rick had made himself untouchable, not just in the eyes of citizens but within the department itself. He had built his power on intimidation, and it had worked until now. When the final report was released, the verdict was undeniable. Rick Thompson was guilty of gross misconduct and abuse of authority. The badge that had once shielded him was stripped from his chest. The announcement came quietly, with no fanfare. No one celebrated his years of service. No one praised his dedication. The man who had once strutted around as if he owned the streets was now a disgraced ex-officer with nothing left but a tarnished name for the town. It was a moment of reckoning. People began to talk more openly about accountability and the importance of standing up for justice. Angela, who had once just been a tired single mother driving home from work, became a quiet symbol of courage. Her fight wasn't loud or dramatic, it was steady, determined, and rooted in truth. And that was what made it powerful. Rick, on the other hand, found himself isolated. The friends who had laughed at his jokes and backed him up in the past stopped returning his calls. The respect he thought he commanded had never been respect at all, it had been fear. And fear fades quickly once the power behind it is gone. He tried to defend himself, muttering to anyone who would listen that it was all exaggerated, that people were out to get him. But no one believed him anymore. His reputation was shattered. Parents pointed him out to their kids as a warning of what happens when you let arrogance and cruelty take over. Rick's downfall wasn't quiet, it echoed. His story spread beyond the courthouse, beyond the town. Local news covered it. Reporters called it an example of the importance of checks and balances in law enforcement. What he thought would never catch up to him had finally done so, and in the worst way possible. Angela never gloated. That wasn't who she was. She continued her life, caring for her family, working her shifts, and holding her head high. But people noticed her differently now. Neighbors greeted her with respect. Strangers thanked her for what she had done. She hadn't just cleared her own name, she had helped uncover years of corruption. Rick's career ended not with honor, but with disgrace. He wasn't remembered as a tough cop who kept order, nor as a leader in his department. He was remembered as a fraud, a man who thought his badge made him untouchable, only to learn the hard way that justice cannot be bullied into silence. In the end, his legacy wasn't the tickets he wrote or the arrests he made. His legacy was a warning of what happens when power is abused, and of how one person's courage can bring the truth to light. And somewhere, sitting quietly in her modest living room, Angela knew one thing for certain: standing up had been worth it. Because sometimes all it takes is one voice to change everything. Months later, Angela came home from work to find an envelope waiting in her mailbox. It was stamped with the seal of the police department. Her hands shook slightly as she opened it, unsure what to expect. Inside was a carefully written letter. It began with words she never thought she would see from the very institution that once tried to silence her. "Thank you." The letter acknowledged her courage in standing up to Officer Rick Thompson. It admitted that her persistence and evidence had exposed flaws in the system that should never have been ignored. Most importantly, it promised reforms. New procedures were being put in place to make sure officers like Rick could never abuse their authority unchecked again. Angela read it twice, then a third time, letting the words sink in. For the first time in months, she felt a genuine sense of relief. She hadn't just fought for herself, she had fought for everyone who might have suffered in silence. She had opened the door for change, and that made every sleepless night, every moment of doubt, worth it. She placed the letter on her kitchen table and smiled softly. Her children, too young to fully understand, saw their mother smiling and knew it was something good. To them, she was just Mom, the woman who worked hard, loved fiercely, and always stood tall. But to the town, Angela had become something more, a symbol of courage, proof that even one person could stand up to abuse and win. Meanwhile, Rick's life looked very different. After losing his badge, he faded into the background. His name was no longer spoken with fear, but with a kind of bitter caution. People mentioned him only as an example of arrogance gone too far. The same badge that had once given him unchecked authority had now become the very thing that destroyed him. His downfall wasn't quiet, it was public. His reputation had crumbled, his career gone. His former allies nowhere to be found. Some said he moved away, unable to stand the stares of the people who once trembled at his presence. Others whispered he stayed in town, keeping his head down, a shadow of the man he used to be. But wherever he was, Rick had learned the hardest truth of all: authority without integrity eventually collapses. Fear can only hold power for so long. Angela, however, carried herself differently. She didn't boast about what she had done, nor did she seek recognition. But people noticed her in ways they never had before. Strangers would nod respectfully when she walked by. Neighbors stopped to thank her, quietly telling her their own stories of moments when they felt powerless. Some admitted they had once been too scared to speak, but Angela's courage gave them hope. Her story began spreading beyond her neighborhood, reaching nearby towns through word of mouth and local newspapers. People repeated it not just as gossip, but as a lesson. They told it to their children, to remind them that standing up for truth was never a waste. Teachers even mentioned it in classrooms, using Angela as a real example of how ordinary people could change unjust systems. Angela herself often thought back to that day when Rick pulled her over. It would have been easier to pay the fine and move on. That's what he expected and what most people did. But something in her heart had told her to fight, to push back against the injustice. She realized now that her small act of resistance had sparked something much larger. The police department's letter was proof of that. Reforms were coming: more accountability, more checks on officers' behavior, more power for citizens to file and follow through on complaints. It wasn't a perfect system, but it was better than what it had been. And it was a step forward. Because one woman decided enough was enough, Rick's story, on the other hand, became a cautionary tale. His name was whispered in training sessions for new officers. Not as a hero of the badge, but as a warning: this is what happens when power corrupts. His arrogance, once mistaken for confidence, was now remembered only as a mask for abuse. His legacy wasn't bravery or honor, it was disgrace. Angela's, however, was very different. She would forever be remembered as the woman who exposed the truth. She hadn't set out to become a symbol. She had only wanted fairness. But her fight became a reminder for everyone. The law is meant to protect, not to control. And so, her story carried a powerful message. It doesn't matter how shiny someone's badge is, how loud their voice is, or how much power they think they have. In the end, no badge, no title, no position makes anyone untouchable, because justice, when fought for, has a way of revealing the truth, and the truth, once seen, cannot be hidden again. Angela knew this better than anyone. And because of her, an entire community would never forget it.